This is part two of a series on metabolic dysregulation. And the first part was really just discussing the importance of sleep in what we have really felt is an important topic. And I said that I would be discussing in the second part coming up today on the brain gut axis and burnout. And as I mention all the time, we will be offering this particular lecture, this webinar, in a PDF form for everyone to be able to look at later on, so that if you want to study it and have questions, you can be looking at the PDF. And so let's dive in. And I'm going to do a review very quickly of what we just discussed in part one, so that you'll know where we're coming from. And in order to do this, I wanted you to remember several things. Number one, what is this inner environmental ecosystem that we call the human gut microbiome, this incredible thing that we have in our bodies? And just to remind you of what that is, remember that the cells of the microbiome, the bacteria and many other little things that live in our gut and in the rest of our body, on our skin, etc., they outnumber human cells at least 10 to 1. There are numbers which say 15 to 1 and even greater. But when you think about that, that's quite remarkable. Even more important, really, is the fact that in terms of genetic information, that all of these bacteria and the protozoa and the viruses, etc., all the genetic information that they contain actually outnumber the human genetic information 150 to 1. In fact, there are well over 3 million bacterial genes in our body at any one time, and that is versus the lowly less than 25,000 human genes that we now know, having decoded our genome, that really we have as human genes. So we represent about 1% of all the genetic information that's sitting in our bodies. And in fact, in terms of bacterial species, frankly, they used to say less than 1,000. Then it was more than 1,000. Then it's over 10,000. It's probably over 30,000 and counting. We really don't know how many there are, but there are massive amounts of different species of bacteria, both in our gut, on the skin, etc. We also have many different fungal species. There are, excuse me, about 350,000, maybe a lot more. And remember that Candida and its various offshoots represents about 80% or 85% of all the fungal and yeast species, but there are many others that are in our gut system, as are parasites and protozoa, hundreds of thousands of them. And then viruses. You know, we've been spending a lot of time in the last couple of years talking about the coronavirus that has hit us, this novel coronavirus, and there are many other coronaviruses that we have had in our systems for, many hundreds of thousands of years. But there are millions of species of viruses. We don't even know how many, and many of them in our body. And remember that greater than 50% of the contents in the colon is bacteria, live bacteria, bacterial detritus, meaning the dead portions of bacteria. And so when we have a fecal sample that you take when you poop, close to 50% of that, frankly, is really colonic bacterial content that has come out of our system. So is it an important part? Yes, it absolutely is. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cough. And so the gut has its own brain. And I'm going to be introducing a lot of these concepts over the next hour or more, slowly but surely so that we're going to be able to get acquainted with all of this. In fact, there's a term for it. It's called the enteric nervous system, and it is intimately connected to the rest of the gut. In fact, it has well over 500 million nerve cells, all kinds of neuronal types. It has autonomous microcircuits that function without needing the higher central nervous system. It has many chemical and mechanical sensors. And it controls a lot of the muscle movement. In the case of the gut, a lot of that muscle movement is autonomously controlled. And the microbiome sitting within the gut has all kinds of different, multiple modulary effects, of which in this slide you see many of them. We have discussed and will be discussing today, not just the aid in digestion of food, which is obvious, but also in its ability to enhance our immune function, both the T and the B cells, and of course, brain chemistry, which we are going to be discussing in great detail today. And remember, if anybody thinks that the microbiome and the microbiota that are in our system are an afterthought within the body, think again. You need to remember that humans, they have, for example, only 20 genes that are encoded to deal with the breakdown of proteins, breakdown carbohydrates. And so when you take a look at mono and polysaccharides that are entering the gut and what is going to break them down, in fact, it is the bacteria that do most of the breakdown. In fact, Bacteroides, which is only one of these thousands of different species, Bacteroides alone has about 260 genes that are specifically involved in the breakdown of carbohydrates. And there are thousands of other bacterial species. So what it's saying to us is that the microbiota is essential for digestive function. Without it, we cannot survive. And they are, in this particular slide, responsible for breaking down the polysaccharides to the short chain fatty acids, which, as we know, provide in humans somewhere between 5 and 15% of what we need for our daily energy requirements. And in some animals, it's 30% or even greater. So for anyone who thinks it isn't important or essential, disabuse yourself of that thought. Remember about the antibiotics. 80% of those that are sold today in the United States, and I would say North America, is for animal production. Why? Well, the reasons have been known for a long time. It's to decrease gastrointestinal infections in cows and also to increase the weight of those animals. In other words, to create more meat. And in fact, even today, after everything we know about what antibiotics are doing, about 50% of beef and poultry production still is given antibiotics. Not to the extent that they used to be, but they're still being given the antibiotics. I'm sorry for this cough. It's not COVID. In any case, they're still being given the antibiotics. How much is being given? About 35 million pounds is the estimate for 2020. That's massive. And that gets into the manure as fertilizer. So you get an antibiotic concentration that increases in the soil, in the plants. So it gets into our food chain. And added to that, there's about 8 million pounds that is used to treat human disease. So we're surrounded by antibiotics. And if you look at that, the situation today is really that it increases the risk for us to have allergies and food sensitivities, especially if you're being given antibiotics early in life, in the first 2 to 3 years of life. And if you're being given and have been given 7 to 10 regimes of antibiotics, you're on a bad course for the rest of your life, because that can adversely program the body's systems for the remainder of your life, especially, which we will discuss soon, the immune system. And so some of the new information that we know is that gut microbiota targeted diets, diets in which you're really trying to deal with the microbiome and to modulate the immune status of the body. When you take a look at those diets, what are the two things that become very important to know? That it is important to eat a high fiber diet, a plant-based high fiber diet, because it's going to allow an increase in a lot of the microbiome function, which is using a lot of that high fiber to nourish itself. And it is going to allow you to begin to elicit a whole bunch of different immune responses, which are important. However, some of those immune responses may be lowered immune response. So you have to be careful. It's not just a high fiber diet that you need. What is even more important is a high fermented food diet. And I've mentioned here on the right, you'll see this. This comes from a wonderful paper that's quite recent. And you'll notice I write new information on the top because literally this came out just a few months ago and is really building on information that we've had for a long time. But when you mate fermented food to the high fiber diet, it becomes extremely important because a high fermented food diet is going to increase microbiome diversity. And diversity is the key component to health. You need a diverse microbiome population. And with that diversity comes a decrease in inflammatory markers. In other words, you get less inflammation. So fermented food is a very powerful modulator of the human microbiome immune system axis. I want everybody to remember that. And it is important because with that ability, it is providing an avenue in terms of treatment, an avenue for us to combat very many different chronic diseases. So this is a key feature and has been shown lately to be important. So as a last point in this review, I am doing a favor to Dr. Fasano, Alessio Fasano, who was the initiator of the work on Zonulin. He's become a good friend. He considers this one of the most important slides, and that is the importance of the first 2 to 3 years of life in driving various kinds of chronic inflammatory diseases and autoimmune disease, and what is really causing what we can consider an epidemic today. And I don't use that word lightly. If you have vaginal delivery, normal vaginal delivery, you have proper nutrition in all of its manifestations, you have a low infection rate, you're getting very few or almost no antibiotic treatment in the first 2-3 years of life, then when you take a look at the microbiome composition, it's going to be balanced. It's going to be what you need. Whereas if you have C-section, improper nutrition, multiple infections for any number of reasons, and because of that, multiple uses of antibiotics, again, in those first 2-3 years of life, what is going to happen? You're going to get dysbiotic behavior, meaning a microbiome that is unbalanced, and with that, an unbalanced immune system. Because if there's a balanced microbiome, then the immune system within the gut is going to have a high threshold before it begins to start functioning. In other words, it's not going to function for almost anything that happens. You're going to have to do something really bad before that immune system shoots off. And that's the way it was developed, is to stay quiescent, to be homeostatic until something really bad happens, like a very bad infection. That's good. And if you add that to our genetic predispositions, you're going to end up with a very normal response to various antigens, be they food antigens or any number of other antigens. In other words, you're going to be in a stable, good state of health. The other way is that if you have dysbiosis, and if you happen to be someone with a genetic predisposition for problems, and add to that the fact that with this dysbiotic behavior, your immune system is now shooting off at almost anything that happens. It has a low threshold. Well, that's going to cause all kinds of pro-inflammatory, high inflammatory responses to any number of antigens. And what's that going to lead to? That's going to lead to a myriad of chronic diseases and epidemics, which is what we're seeing today. And when you take a look at what prebiotics, which by the way is even in many cases more important even than probiotics, it's what you give in order to have your bacteria happy. It's what they eat. So if you give good prebiotics and probiotics, which together is called symbiotics, that is going to be able to establish a much better microbiome composition and is going to help balance out your microbiome. And what it's going to also do is decrease the amount of dysbiosis. So that's the review of last time. But let me throw out a few things to you. How many of you said, boy, I got this gut instinct, or I've got this gut feeling, or hey, go with your gut, or always trust your gut. It knows what your head hasn't figured out yet. What does all that mean? Well, what it's really saying is that we have known in our general English parlance, in colloquial expressions, that there is a gut-brain connection. And in fact, there is. And there have been thousands of experiments. Let me show you one because I like this cartoon. In 2004, a study by Sudo et al., actually a very interesting one. They looked at germ-free mice in the gut and those that were nautobiotic. Nautobiotic means that you effectively know the microorganisms in general that are in the gut. You have controlled them to a certain degree. And then what you do is you set off a screaming cat at them, which would normally produce a fight or flight response, right? The classic response of the mouse that says, I better get out of here. Well, in the germ-free mice, they get an exaggerated HPA response, meaning the adrenaline response, the cortisol response, and so on, is very, very high in these mice because it hasn't been tempered by what the gut would normally do. Yes, you can have fight or flight, but it needs to be tempered. It needs to be balanced. So if you gave these germ-free mice some bifidobacteria, one of the things that happens is that it cools down that exaggerated HPA stress response. In other words, it takes something that is out of balance and starts to bring it into balance. And we see this throughout life. Because if you take a look at the gut-brain development, and we're going to go through what that is in just a few minutes, but let me throw this out to you. Throughout life, we are developing this symbiotic relationship of the gut and the brain. And it starts before we're even born. Even in the maternal period, prenatally, there's already a prenatal diet that's important. And the gut and the brain are already beginning to start developing. And then the child is born. And from that point on, everything that happens from ground zero time-wise is going to affect that gut-brain development. And we're going to go through a lot of this, whether it's language development, whether it's the way in which the brain develops, and the gut for that matter, with the amount of intestinal length, the amount of microbiota that are there, the kind of diet. For example, is that baby getting breast milk? If not, what are they getting? And then as you move through life, the same thing with diet. In terms of delivery, what's the delivery mode? We talked about that a few moments ago. What kind of environment are they living in, etc. So when you have your PDF, you can go through all of these and it's going to tell you how they develop. But one thing we do know is that if the microbiome is dysbiotic, that's going to increase the incidence of mental disorders. There are hundreds and hundreds of studies that show this. We know that. The question is why? Well, part of the answer is diet. It plays a key role in that. For example, I mentioned the issue of breast milk. It's extremely important. We'll go over that in a few more minutes, but that is incredibly important. And so let's develop this a little bit further. What is the gut-brain axis? And is it the only thing we should be talking about in the axis? Well, we do know that chemical and mechanical signals from the gut lumen are going to have an effect because they are going to send signals up to the brain. What kind of signals do they send up? Well, the gut is involved in digestion and it's involved in a tremendous amount of immune defense. So in the case of digestion, for example, we all know that when there is hunger, there is a ghrelin response. Ghrelin is a hormone that begins to, it's developed in the stomach and partly in the intestine, and it tells the brain, I'm hungry, and you need to start developing everything that is necessary in order to get me to eat. Or I've had enough. Satiation. Leptin is the particular molecule that is developed in the gastrointestinal system that is going to say, I've eaten enough. If all of that works well, that signal goes to the brain. It's going to be integrated, and there's going to be a behavioral response to that, which can be as simple as start eating or stop eating. But it needs to get the signal from the gut. And we're going to discuss in a few moments how that actually happens. And so I want you to think of three main aspects of this axis, which are then going to be made much more complicated, but I'm going to want you to keep these in mind. And the first one is the ability of the gut to develop neurotransmitters, and it develops them in great numbers. For example, serotonin. Greater than 80% of the serotonin that is produced in the body and that is used in the brain is produced in the gut. It's not produced in the brain, it's produced in the gut, and it's used in the brain. And that is because the gut cells produce a large quantity of tryptophan. And that is what actually creates serotonin. And serotonin, as we know, affects brain signaling. So let's keep that one in mind. Secondly, the gut is extremely important, as I said, as a seminal part of our immune system. And the microbiome is what really is prompting immune cells to produce the various cytokines or signaling molecules which are going to go to the brain as well as other parts of the body. So it is developing the cytokines which are sent out through the immune system and go both through nervous innervation and through other modalities in the blood up to the brain, and that's going to influence the neurophysiology of the brain. And the third major component is that the bacteria produce a whole series of metabolites. I mentioned before the short-chain fatty acids. Well, we do know that the microbes do break down complex carbohydrates to these SCFAs. And one of them is butyrate. And butyrate is an SCFA that is extremely important because it tightens the cell connections of the brain barrier, the blood-brain barrier. And I'm giving you just one example of hundreds. So both as a neurotransmitter area, as an area where cytokines are sent out to signal, and its ability to produce metabolites that are going to affect the brain, those are the three main areas that I want you to keep in mind over the next few minutes. So let's take a look at the gut bacteria and mood. How does it affect our mood? Well, I just mentioned a moment ago, and I'm going to go into much more detail now, that the gut is a critical area for neurotransmitter production. And we know, as I said earlier, that bacteria synthesize tryptophan. And they synthesize it from a protein that is used by bacteria. Keep that in mind, by bacteria as a precursor for their aromatic amino acids that are essential for them in their metabolic pathway. And one of these is corzamate. Corzamate is used by bacteria in their metabolism. That's the way they metabolize stuff. And what do they produce as a waste product? Tryptophan. Isn't that interesting? So bacteria are producing tryptophan as a waste, and we then use that waste product, tryptophan, in the gut to produce serotonin. And guess what else we produce? Serotonin also happens to produce melatonin, which we know well, extremely important. And that's part of our saliva profile, which you're going to be utilizing with Fluids IQ. And corzamate does more than that. It also produces tyrosine, which also gets produced through another pathway, through phenylalanine, produces tyrosine. Is that the end of it? No. Tyrosine then produces dopamine. And dopamine, together with serotonin, are arguably the most important duo, apart from GABA, in the brain. And dopamine is a precursor to norepinephrine and epinephrine. Epinephrine, another name for it, is adrenaline. Norepinephrine is noradrenaline, two of the very, very important parts of the sympathetic nervous system. So, do I need to say more? Bacteria have a key, essential role in neurotransmitter production and function. And when you take a look at the microbiota and their importance as neurotransmitters and the effect on anxiety reduction by the use of GABA, I want you to remember our three things that we talked about earlier: the immune system, the cytokines, the development of tryptophan and therefore serotonin, and the metabolites. Remember that. Well, look at what the bacteria produce. Bacteria are producing the lactobacillus, the bifidobacteria, they produce GABA. And GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter of the brain. Incredibly important. And the alterations in central GABA utilization in the brain is clearly implicated in most anxiety and depressive states. And lacto and bifido are extremely important in producing it. Well, many different bacteria, Escherichia, Bacillus, Saccharomyces, they produce norepinephrine. Lactobacillus produces acetylcholine, which is one of the main transmitters in the synapses of the brain. Various other bacilli and Serratia produce dopamine. Candida, Streptomyces, Enterobacteria, Escherichia produce serotonin. And in fact, we know that that's important because it then sends those signals up the vagus nerve that is attached from the gut up into the brain. And if you vagotomize mice, in other words, you cut the vagus nerve, which is the major communications pathway, you're going to have behavioral effects and neurochemical effects that are detrimental to the brain function because they're not getting the effect of what the gut is normally sending over to them. And it gets even better because if you have a permeability problem in the gut, what is that going to do in terms of what the bacteria are showing, what inflammatory issues are going to happen, and what effect is that going to have on brain and behavior? Well, we do know that with increased intestinal permeability, One of the things that happens is that the lipopolysaccharides, which, as you know, are the membranes of gram-negative bacteria, they're going to get into the other side of the barrier of the gut quite easily. And apart from everything else that LPS does as a toxin, it also will induce depressive symptoms. So gut microbiota, and probiotics for that matter, can alter brain neurochemistry. As a case in point, one of the probiotic treatments that's been around for a long time is the use of lactofarciminous. And we know that giving that as a probiotic will prevent or help prevent both stress-induced hypersensitivity and colonic paracellular hyperpermeability. In other words, it's going to decrease the permeability of the gut, and in doing that, it's going to prevent a lot of stress response through the HPA axis. And therefore, because of that, will decrease neuroinflammation. All of that is to say, the bacteria play a key role in being able to decrease inflammation and affect brain function and behavior. So it plays an important and I would say an essential role. And in fact, we now know that certain organisms may be very useful therapeutic adjuncts in various stress-related disorders, such as anxiety and depression and so on. So, we mentioned before the effect of the immune system and the cytokines and the pre and probiotics and the SCFAs. We know that during dysfunction of the axis, a dysfunctional intestinal barrier where you have very open junctions is going to permit a microbiota-driven pro-inflammatory state, because it's going to create more inflammation. The immune cells are going to kick off and send signals to the brain telling it that there is a problem, and the brain is going to respond in a very specific way. But I want to, in this case, stress one of those three areas, in this case, tryptophan. Remember that I told you that tryptophan, or tryptophan, I don't know how some of you say it, its normal pathway, as I told you, leads to the production of serotonin and melatonin. But what happens when the area is dysfunctional? Well, if there is a barrier dysfunction, if there is an open barrier, one of the things that it does is it upregulates or increases, that's what upregulation means, a different pathway than the normal pathway that tryptophan has. And it doesn't produce as much serotonin and melatonin. What it does is it goes through the kynurenine pathway, which is well known as a pathway which normally is not used. And the reason it isn't used that often is because when you end up utilizing that pathway, you end up with kynurenic and quinolonic acid being produced, which is then catabolized in the liver. All of that is to say, what it does produce is neurotoxin, a gliotoxin, pro-oxidants, and pro-inflammatory mediators. In other words, you do not want to be involved in this pathway. You don't want tryptophan to have to go into that pathway. But what's going to happen when you have a dysfunctional intestinal barrier, it ain't just a problem for the gut. It's going to affect the way in which the brain functions. And so by doing that, we then understand that intestinal barrier dysregulation or immune dysfunction has many potential neuropsychiatric consequences. And an important one is the depression. Depression is a key problem apart from anxiety and cognitive dysfunction, impaired social function. But what about depression? Well, what is depression? Well, depression, we now begin to understand, is really a decrease in the speed of brain function. And what does that mean? Well, some of the reasons why it happens is because of imbalance. Imbalance in what? Well, an imbalance in digestion. So you have a low number of essential amino acids, which we'll discuss in a minute. You have a dysfunction in insulin and blood sugar. You definitely have an increase in intestinal permeability. And because of that, because of all of that, it leads to insufficient fuel being able to be taken up by the gut. The gut is not able to function properly in taking in nutrients and utilizing them properly. And that creates a dysbiotic environment, as does many rounds of antibiotics. Because if you didn't have all those other three problems, if you take a lot of antibiotics, that's going to cause a problem in and of itself. So what's the result of all of that? Insufficient neurotransmitters. And that's going to lead to both slower and abnormal brain function. And the signs and symptoms of that are pretty well known. Brain fog, anxiety, outright depression, or the contrary imbalance to that which happens in certain people, which is just the opposite: insomnia, panic, aggression. That is what you hear in people who have manic depressive cycling. And so when you talk about digestion, you'll see here on the top, I'm talking about number one. As I mentioned, tryptophan goes through to develop serotonin and dopamine, sometimes through tyrosine. And remember that tryptophan and tyrosine are two of what we call the essential amino acids. In other words, those are amino acids that have to come from food or bacteria. We cannot produce them ourselves in the body. They have to come from outside, either from food sources or bacteria. And the bacteria will metabolize a lot of these foods that we cannot digest. And I mentioned before, it's their waste that produces serotonin and dopamine. And so I want to spend a few moments, and I did mention to Jennifer and to Amber that we're going to be here over an hour because I do want to spend time on this. It's very important. Here is number 3, gut permeability, which I'm going to discuss in some detail. And the reason for that is because when you do the tests of barrier, you need to understand that you're looking not only at a permeability problem for the gut, but how does it affect the brain? So let's look at this top part first. We're going to look at what goes on in the intestinal lumen, the entry of zonulin, of various tight junction proteins, antigens, pathogens, toxins, bacterial lipopolysaccharides, inflammatory cytokines that get in from the lumen into the lamina propria, which is the other side. And so when you look at what zonulin, what it is, its major function, which here we give you as an example for people who have celiac disease, when they have gliadin, they shoot off signals that increases zonulin. What does it do? It triggers pathogenic bacteria and a whole bunch of food antigens, like gliadin, for example, to effectively open the tight junctions. Opening the tight junctions increases permeability. And what does that do? It increases the ability of all of these things that normally should never be getting into this portion, the lamina propria. Suddenly in come all of these toxins, lipopolysaccharides, etc. They are presented to the immune system. The immune system then says, uh-oh, we got a problem here, and it begins to develop an immune response. And remember, you normally want it at a high threshold. You don't want an immune response to shoot off at all times. But if you're not careful, that's what it's going to do. And so it gets exposed to all of these stressors that I mentioned. It triggers an immune response. That immune response triggers inflammation, which starts to damage the cells of the gut even more, going into a vicious cycle, increases even more intestinal permeability, more passage of all of these toxins, etc., which then interacts with the HPA axis and is going to affect neurotransmitter metabolism. Well, so you say, okay, that's bad enough. But then all of that now is in the blood. So these various pro-inflammatory cytokines, everything else I've talked about that was in the gut, now doesn't stay in the gut. It moves up through the blood and through the nervous system, and it eventually reaches the area of the brain. So in the blood, the stressors are there, the zonulin is there, all the various LPSs, the toxins, all of that is now coursing through the blood, and it gets to the blood-brain barrier. When it gets there, zonulin binds to the blood-brain barrier receptors. And let me state right now the importance of zonulin. If anyone thought that zonulin only acts in the gut and opens up the tight junctions there, that's bad enough. But let me tell you, cells throughout the body are affected by zonulin and will open up paracellular or intercellular areas between the cells all over the place, in the heart, in the skin, and in the brain. So there are particular zonulin receptors in the brain itself. And sure enough, the blood-brain barrier can open up. That vaunted closed wall can actually open up. And when it opens up, the same kind of thing happens. All of those players can now get in. In this case, the astrocytes, which have been sitting there as a net in the brain, protecting it, all of a sudden they start misbehaving because they get damaged. An immune response takes place. It's stimulated by microglia, which are other cells in the brain that normally are signaling the neurons. What happens? Same problem. You get an immune response, more inflammation. It increases free radical generation, even more reactive oxygen species. And what does that do? That creates problems within the brain cells itself, which manifests itself in mood disorders. So, if you then add to that antibiotic exposure, the risk for depression, anxiety, etc. goes up, because the changes in the microbiota, dysbiotic behavior, if it increases, it'll increase the risk of a whole number of different psychiatric conditions. So this study here, which by the way, wasn't that long ago, it's just several years ago, studied the effect of various types of antibiotic groups on its ability to increase the risk of things like depression, anxiety, psychosis, etc. And the result is, frankly, quite frightening, because it showed that the risk of depression and anxiety with all the 7 antibiotic groups that they used in that study were quite similar. If you give a single antibiotic course in a year, it can be associated with up to 20% greater risk of having depression and anxiety. You give 5 courses of antibiotics in a year, and it can be associated with fully 50% greater risk in anxiety, depression, but interestingly enough, not psychotic behavior, because that goes through some different pathways. But even notwithstanding no effect on psychosis, think about what that implies. So, therefore, we know then that there is a bidirectional gut microbiota brain connection. And I've added microbiota to that axis. It is an extremely important part of it. So there's an ability then, we know, of the microbiota to influence the brain through behavior, mood, etc. There's activation of the gut neural pathways to the brain. How does it do it? As I said before, activating the immune response and through metabolites, which are producing substances which will affect the brain. The brain, on the other hand, has the ability to influence the intestine and the microbiota in it by modulating the normal gut habitat. And it does that by inducing, in many cases through stress, many changes. What does it do? It changes the way in which the enteric cells function, in which both the immune system and the cells of the barrier actually function, and the ability to produce mucin, the mucoid layer sitting in the gut, extremely important, and motility, how the gut muscles move stuff along. All of that is going to affect the release of neurotransmitters. And by the way, when you're going to read the PDF, you'll be able to go into even more detail when you get exposed to stress. The same thing in more detail, the bidirectional connection, which for those of you who really want to know more about it, all of these different things are affected in the way the gut actually signals the brain, and that creates an HPA axis dysfunction. And remember again what I mentioned earlier, the various types of neurotransmitters that are produced by the gut bacteria, extremely important. So, for those who want even more information on healing opportunities, I told Jennifer I would spend a few moments on this. And so I do want to give you an understanding of what are some of the natural treatments for things like anxiety and depression. Let's take a look at number one, which is meal times. One of the things that you want to do is to balance your sugars. And I mentioned sugar, blood sugar, and insulin earlier. Well, this is not a small point. It's critical. And what you want to do is to keep yourself in this green area. You want normal blood sugar levels because the brain, let alone the rest of the body, requires balanced insulin and blood sugar levels in order to produce these neurotransmitters in a normal fashion, homeostatically. If you're out of that green area, if you're swinging wildly above and below that, high swings in blood sugar for various reasons, and I'm not giving you a lecture now on insulin and blood sugar, but it's very clear that that can cause insulin resistance, inflammation, the release of stress hormones, the rise in things like epinephrine and the cortisol levels from the adrenals, especially at bedtime, which then disrupts the sleep cycle. If you disrupt the sleep cycle, as I said in our first part that we did last month, that has very, very damaging effect. So by skipping meals haphazardly, you can lower blood sugar, which again, it can be just as bad as increasing it, because what that will do is it's going to thin out the gut wall. That's going to lead to more allergies, bloating, pain. So the message, you've got to maintain a normal blood sugar level. One of the ways of doing that is to keep your glycemic index, which is noted on food choices, keep that as low as possible. The glycemic index, by the way, is a scale that ranks carbohydrate containing foods or drinks, and it's an index shows you by taking these food and drinks how much is it going to raise blood sugar levels when you're doing that eating and drinking. So bottom line, you need to find a way of being able to have that person you're helping understand that they need to choose foods that in combination are going to be low in refined carbohydrates and starches. So there are four key supplements, and there were a number of people who asked whether we could discuss some of that, and that's why I'm doing this. There are four key supplements to help increase serotonin levels. One of them, melatonin, because melatonin is going to help lower cortisol and the catecholamines, such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, etc. And that we know is bringing in sleep, because sleep is essential, and that is going to be affected by melatonin. 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is a precursor to the biosynthesis of serotonin, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and helps to raise serotonin, and it is able to also lower dopamine at the same time. And there are 5-HTP supplements which are available. And then there are a whole number of supplements for methylation which can help. Of course, the B vitamins, especially B vitamin 12, 9, and 6. Adenosyl L-methionine, SAMIs, as they're called, that is a very well-known and well-liked supplement because it does function to do many things, but one of the things it does is it is able to work in a way that it stabilizes neurotransmitter function. So does trimethylglycine, betaine, which many of you are familiar with. All of that is going to stabilize, if not increase, neurotransmitter production. And L-theanine, which again is a very important supplement, it is one of the amino acids that is able to raise the brain levels of GABA, serotonin, and dopamine, these wonderful neurotransmitters that we love so much. So these are four key supplements that you should keep in mind. And there are at the same time 5 other key supplements to help gut repair, because the whole message here is repair the gut, repair the brain. So, glutamine, you see that mentioned time and again for good reason. It is one of the main amino acids that you use for cell energy in the gut. So in the gastrointestinal tract, it's going to help reduce permeability, and therapeutically, anything between 30 and 100 grams a day for short periods is good. Probiotics, there's no question that various strains of the Lacto, Bifido, the S. boulardii, which is a yeast, it's Saccharomyces boulardii, Streptomyces, etc. All of these in the presence, folks, of fermented and fiber-containing foods. I always mention probiotics in and of themselves is not the answer. It can even make matters worse sometimes. You always, if you're going to use probiotics, always bring that together with the use of prebiotics, which in this case means fermented and the fiber-containing foods, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. Vitamin D3, extremely important because it reduces, apart from everything else, it reduces permeability of the tight, really tightens up the tight junctions, and that's going to reduce permeability. Betaine, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. And another thing which I mentioned before, and now I'm going to talk about it. In breast milk, you have what's called the monoglycerides, human monoglycerides in breast milk. Close to 50% of what you see in breast milk is the HMOs. But the interesting thing is the human cells can't metabolize HMOs. So why does breast milk contain so much HMOs? And the answer we know, it's very clear. It's the main nutrient for commensal bacteria in the gut, especially in the colon. So the body knows, the system knows, the mother knows that the breast milk is going to be there to feed the good bacteria and make sure that that creates the environment in the newborn to keep pathogenic bacteria in control. But 22% of women, give or take, don't have HMOs or not sufficient amount. So today we have available powders in the form of a prebiotic, which can be taken. So I want everybody to remember that specifically. And they're important nutrients. Couldn't give a lecture without talking about that. Bone broth, of course, the amino acids and minerals that it contains, especially proline, glycine, L-glutamine, all the extremely important ones. Proline, of course, which is a precursor for collagen, which we know that you need for repair of cells and bone formation. Kefir, very important in and of itself. There are a lot of homemade yogurts and some that are in the market. Fermented dairy, in fact, is an extremely important prebiotic food, and yogurt is one of them. The various fermented vegetables, we're now getting into the weeds of the various fermented foods, but it bears repeating. All kinds, sauerkraut, kimchi, the coconuts, kefir, all of that is important. Coconut oil, for those who like it, yes, it is an antimicrobial. Various types of fish, especially wild fish. I mention that because if you're going to eat farmed fish, please make sure that you have an idea of where they've been farmed and how they're being farmed, and whether or not in the farming they are able to take away the waste products of the fish in a proper way. If you cannot be convinced that that is being done, don't get farmed fish. You then should eat the wild fish, be it salmon, tuna, etc. As we know, they're very high in omega-3 fatty acids, which, apart from anything else that it does, reduces inflation. Flaxseed, which we've known forever, has a very high amount of soluble fiber, which is extremely important. And last but not least, of course, steamed vegetables, which is an important part of everything from, the Mediterranean diets, paleo diets, you name it, extremely important. And of course, aerobic exercise and metabolism. It goes without saying that that is extremely important. But I do want to show you some new information, which bears repeating. And this is the enzymes that are implicated positively in the effects of exercise. And so one of the things that you need to know is when you exercise, there is a particular enzyme, which is an NAD oxidase, that is produced, and it is essential for exercise-induced oxidative species. Why? Because when you exercise, you naturally produce reactive oxygen species. That is something that we do normally because of the increase in oxygen usage, and that produces ROS. Well, you say, wait a minute, but ROS is bad. Well, it's bad if it sticks around. But normally what we do, we produce higher amounts of ROS, and that produces higher amounts of NAD, and the muscles know that in order to do this abundance, which we know decreases with age, we know that if you increase that amount of enzyme, the muscles will create an adaptive response to then decrease it. In other words, they will increase their metabolic efficiency to be able to take care of it. So if you exercise, you then bring in everything you need to be able to decrease the reactive oxygen species, and that's good. So by exercising, you produce an adaptive response. If you don't produce that adaptive metabolic response, it makes you much more prone to the development of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So by the way, I just want to take you back to the main point, and that is what we do know. As all of you are aware, autism has become an epidemic in our society. Back in 1975, not in 1875, in 1975, which is not that long ago, 1 in 5,000 had someone on the ASD, the autism spectrum. In 2012, it was up to 1 in 88. By 2020, the estimates now are, by the CDC, that we're somewhere in the area of around 1 in 59 or even more than that. And it is expected that if it continues this way, by 2040, we may be looking at maybe 1 in 3 people that is going to be on the autism spectrum. That is absolutely frightening. Now, why is that happening? Well, we do know, apart from many other things, that the microbiome plays an extremely important role in all of that. Because apart from the genetic factors, the gut microbiota play a role. And we do know, for example, and this is new information, came out just a few months ago, the gut microbiota play that role in ASD because the children with ASD have very distinctive and underdeveloped range, diversity, and volume of gut bacteria. And that's not related to their diet. In other words, we know that the microbiome in people with ASD at an early age is already different. And because we know that the microbiome is so important to neurotransmitter synthesis, and if it's markedly reduced in children with ASD, we know it'll have profound consequences on the psychiatric abnormality. So what's the conclusion of this author? No different than the conclusion of many other authors, that shifts in gut microbiota, especially during early life development, may have important functional roles in the pathogenesis of ASD. Pretty frightening. And it gets even better. Autism immune problems can be caused by maternal gut bacteria. In other words, when does it start? And this, by the way, if you look at the bottom, you're going to see this just came out. In fact, it's going to be published in printed form in a few days from now. So this is really new information. And what does it say? Fetal exposure, the fetus's exposure to the maternal womb inflammation increases susceptibility to gut inflammation that's going to be induced by bacteria later in life. So that fetus, because it was exposed to inflammation in the womb, is already going to have a problem, because during pregnancy, IL-17A, which is an inflammation creator, it is heightened following an infection. So it changes the mother's microbiome and therefore alters the fetus's brain development and therefore affects that offspring's immune system, because it alters a very specific part of the immune system, the CD4 plus T cells, which are critical in the immune system. So it is changing the immune development, and that is priming that offspring for inflammatory attacks of the gut later in life. So what's the conclusion? Maternal immune activation due to infection during pregnancy is a common environmental driver for the neurodevelopment and immunological symptoms of individuals with ASD. That's quite a statement. So it starts very early in life. And by the way, for those of you who can't get enough of this science, I'm just letting you know that there's a deeper dive, which is in the PDFs, and you can all ask me about that later on, because I had a whole bunch of different studies that go into all of this in much, much greater detail. And when I give a lecture all day on this, I actually go through this so you'll understand it. But the bottom line is, it still goes through those three main areas which we discussed earlier. And so I'm just going to spend a few minutes before we finish on burnout, because that is something that you're going to be seeing a lot of people, you will be seeing in your offices and so on. And you want to evaluate and try to rebuild the burned out brain. Well, what's burnout? Well, burnout is a term, it's a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress. But interestingly enough, it's not used as a term for other areas of life. Normally, workplace is where burnout is normally used. And that has not been successfully managed. And it's characterized by three very specific general dimensions: the feeling of energy depletion, the feeling of negativism, which is related to the job, and therefore manifesting itself in reduced professional efficiency or efficacy. So someone says, I'm burnt out. And the symptoms of that, we all either have had it ourselves or we've noted it, everything from mental sluggishness, outright anxiety or depression, or just the opposite, insomnia, fatigue, and all the parts that you see on the right, poor concentration, memory, etc. And the contributors to that, to the burned out brain, are mental and emotional stress on the job, the remuneration you're getting, the relationships. Today we're hearing about the epidemic, what is it called? The Great Resignation that is placing millions of people. I think it's 5 to 7 million people in the US have just quit their jobs in the last couple of years. We understand why. Sleep deprivation can cause it. Blood sugar instability, big surprise. Chronic inflammation and infection. And we know why some of that is happening. We know that it is extending the eating windows. It's the lack of fasting, the lack of exercise, the lack of bright light during the day, or just the opposite. You're getting excess bright or blue light at bedtime. Worst thing to do is to have blue light. It's to have your phones in front of your face before you go to sleep. The nutritional deficits that we've discussed earlier, and of course, the various toxins. And so I'm not going to go through a lot of the issues that you need to look at. You can look at that in the PDF, but I do want to look at circadian rhythms and at fasting, because one of the things that you need to understand is that every cell in the body has a circadian rhythm. It's not just the brain, every cell. So you need to really look at a number of things that could be causing the problem. It could be as straightforward as apnea. Due to a problem happening in the upper respiratory tract, that person stops breathing when they're sleeping, and so they can't sleep well. They have hormonal problems, which we can go through it, and we have in other lectures. Remember, I talked about this blue light 1 or 2 hours before bedtime, and when a room is too hot. And so one of the things you want to do is you want to avoid or eliminate inflammatory foods. Definitely avoid, if you can, glutens or soy. And for those who really have a problem, avoid dairy, avoiding alcohol in excess, clearly. And then there are other sources of inflammation, some of which we've alluded to already. The LPSs, which is lipopolysaccharides. And in another lecture, I'm going to tell you about what we're going to be coming out with in some other assays, which are going to include LPS. But LPS is an extremely pervasive toxin in the gut, especially coming from pathogenic gram-negative bacteria. Everything from H. pylori, enterobacteria, etc. You see them here. You want to decrease the ability of LPS to get into the system. But let's not forget that even gram-positive bacteria can cause peptoglycans to get into the system. These are also biotoxins. They are in high numbers when you have SIBO. So you want to decrease the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. In other words, high amounts of bacteria where they shouldn't be, even if they're gram-positive. Don't think the word gram-plus tells you everything is great. It isn't. So you want to avoid the various endotoxins as much as you can. Clearly, you want to avoid fungal toxins. What's one of the major ones? Candida, especially in its hyphal form. And somebody should ask me about that again, and I'll discuss it. And so the last thing that I want to just stress is the issue of when you feed yourself and fasting. And for people who have problems with burnout, I would say that this is probably one of the things they should look at. And that is what has been fondly called the 6-18. That is the 6-hour interval when you eat and the 18 hours when you are, quote, fasting. Or to put it another way, when you're not eating. And if you do that on a regular basis, that has a positive effect. Because one of the things that it's going to do, it's going to encourage the development of an increase in what's called BDNF. And there's a lot of work that's been done for many years on what's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It is a protein that supports the survival of the neurons and actually increases new neuronal behavior. So it's going to help the growth and the differentiation of new neurons, new synapses, which are going to manifest themselves from a behavioral standpoint in less feeling of burned out. Eat your first meal the same time each day, whatever that meal is going to be. Control caffeine intake. In fact, water fasting is one of the ways in which you do a fasting cycle, in which you also have your minerals and vitamins and salt as part of the water that you're taking in. And this busy slide is something you can look at in your PDF, but it is the effect of fasting. And the effect of fasting is such that if you start a fast, by the 12th hour, you're getting an increase in growth hormones that are needed for cell synthesis. That's happening within the first 12 hours. By the first 18 hours, and remember I talked about 6 and 18, so for people who do the 18, they're already seeing a decrease in amyloid, a decrease in what's called advanced glycated end products, which is what cells produce and decreases their viability, and old damaged proteins are already being taken out. Why? Because you have the start of what's known affectionately as autophagy or autophagy. What is that? A big word for the body's removing damaged cells. The body's doing it constantly. A cell gets damaged, the body says, get it out. The phagocytes come in and get rid of the cell. So you get an increase in autophagy within the first 18 hours, let alone all the other stuff which happens if you continue fasting. I'm not advocating fasting of 24 hours or 48 hours, but there's no doubt that in the first 18 hours, you're already getting increases in those things. So, exercise, nutritional support, the same as I mentioned before. So then the final thing is to tell you that as screening assessments, just remember, salivary testing, the testing of the adrenals and all of the sex hormones, melatonin, Sig-A, which you're going to get in your stress and hormone profile, the diurnal cortisol to get a 4-point measure, the sex hormones, etc., is extremely important. Blood tests, well, of course, you want to look at thyroid function, etc. With the dried blood spot, which fluids offers to you, you're also looking at the permeability of the gut, etc. And the patient's lifestyle survey. What is their eating time window, which I just mentioned a moment ago? Their exposure to outdoor light and blue light, their exercise regimes, and their work and travel habits. And so that, folks, was a very quick tour of that area.